Hello, and welcome back to Conquering Finale. My name is Jason Lafredo, and today we're doing another spotlight on plugins. We are looking at Patterson's note spacing plugin, following right on the heels of music spacing the Finale Frontier. As promised, we are going to look at this really cool plugin by Patterson, and I will leave a link in the description so that you can get the plugin and download the whole Patterson suite if you want. It's actually really great. So, but once you do that, you install it. It comes in the plugins menu. We're looking for Patterson plugins, and the one we're looking for is right here. It's called Note Spacing, and we get this option, and this is version 6.07, which as of the taping of this video was released only a few days ago. Now, is the case with a lot of these Patterson plugins, there's a lot to them. It's slightly complicated, could be confusing, so hopefully I'll clear that up for all of you so that you can make the most of this note spacing plugin, because it actually is pretty cool and it does some really nifty things. So the big picture here is that there's sort of three sections. You have this big blank white space here on the top. This is going to be populated by lists in a few minutes as soon as I start adding them with the plus button. And basically the lists are going to be a way to parse out different types of music spacing on different measures. So you could have different types of music spacing for bars 1 through 4, 5 through 8, etc. And you can create as many list items as you want. What's in the middle section here is what's going into the list. So you can actually set different reference durations, different reference widths, scaling factors, all that stuff, and then set the range from measure X to measure Y, or all measures or whatever. And there's some other interesting things that you can do here. And so all of these settings in the middle section will get put into a list item, and you'll get a bunch of lists, which again I'll do in a few minutes. And then there's the bottom section, which sort of stands alone. Whatever's set in the bottom section will apply to the whole window, will apply to the whole plugin, and all of the items on the list simultaneously. So it is a little bit confusing, but these bottom items are sort of universal to the plugin. It's only this middle section that gets parsed out differently in the list items. And interestingly, if there are no list items here, then whatever's set in the bottom section will be applied to whatever you have selected, or if nothing is selected, then everything gets music spaced in the file. So you can actually use the bottom section sort of a la carte without even worrying about the list. So that being said, I think I'm actually going to start with the things that are in the bottom, because again, they will apply to everything anyway. And there's a few options here. So the first thing is minimum distance between ledger lines. And currently you can see that it's set to 0.04167. And it should be set to match what you have in the document options for music spacing for this value here for minimum distance between items. The thing about this minimum distance between items is that it applies to everything. So it's the minimum distance between chords, articulations, ledger lines, lyrics, etc. This is the value that it's using. What's nice about this plugin is that it gives us a specific value if we want to have a different minimum distance just between the ledger lines. The theory being that sometimes the ledger lines will get too close unless you add just a little bit more distance. So it's giving us a little flexibility to have a different distance for everything except for the ledger lines, which can have either more or less. So simply changing this value here, we can make a subtle change. Let's make it 0.055. And again, with nothing else in this window, with no list items and just nothing selected, when you press OK, it'll apply the note spacing on the whole file. So we can just do that and press OK. And you may have seen it, but it changed the ledger lines on this top system on the second page. Let me just zoom in so we can get a better look at that. We'll go over here. There we go. And actually just select all and press 4 to reset it to the standard note spacing in Finale. And then we'll run the Patterson note spacing with that extra value of 0.055 for distance between ledger lines. And hopefully you just saw that there was a little bit more space allotted to the notes with the ledger lines here. So that's kind of handy. Comes in handy specifically with some tight spacing where the ledger lines are starting to get a little bit too close to each other. This is a really nifty and quick way to fix that. I should point out that this is setting a distance, right? So you're not adding 0.055 to the distance between ledger lines. You're not adding that to the 0.4167. It's actually just setting the distance at 0.055. The next option, extra space for Upstem Flags, this option is additive. And this is specific to upstem flags. So I guess the theory is that sometimes with these upstem flags, you can see here in my horn F part, they do get a little bit closer to things than what might be comfortable. So some people actually prefer to have the upstem flags just get a little bit of extra space right here. And so all we have to do is, put a value of like, let's say 0.1 in there. And just run music spacing or run the Patterson note spacing, and you'll see that there's just a little bit more room between the upstem flag and the flat here, and also the down here in the piano between the E flat and the D natural here. So these values can be small. I mean, 0.1 is probably too large. Maybe 0.05 is a little bit better, just to give your flags a little breathing room. This value can be negative, by the way, so you can choose negative 0.05, and it will get closer. And you can see that that's actually probably too close now. You can see the flags kind of overlapping with the flats there. So let's go back to 0.05. All right, and again, these options will run no matter what you have, or if you have nothing in the list here. So yeah, so that's what's going on there. The next option is just a simple checkbox, and it's called Force Empty Measures to Minimum Measure Width. And again, we'll go back to the document options here, and we'll talk about the minimum measure width and maximum measure width, which I did a video on, so hopefully I can put a link to that right here, just so you can understand what's going on. As I mentioned in that video, if you have your minimum measure width set to 0, that's all well and good, but sometimes it's almost impossible to actually get a calculated value of 0 in Finale. So you can use this to your advantage with this Patterson note spacing plugin by having this set to 0. If you force empty measures to minimum measure width, and I'm going to go later in this file because I did something here at the end. I created sort of a hanging courtesy situation. I actually did a video on this, a short little hot tips video to show you how to do this. This is obviously if you have this piece kind of attacking another piece and you want to show the key signature and time signature of the next movement or something, this is how you do that. And the way to do this is just set this measure width to 0. Just like that. But you can also do it with this note spacing plugin. If you have force empty measure width to minimum measure width, you can just select that measure here and run the plugin, and it'll basically do the same thing. So now that measure width is set to 0. So that's a neat little option as well. Let me just undo all of that. Oops, there we go. The tricky thing here is that you don't want to have like all of the measures selected, because if you do have empty measures here, it's going to make all of them 0, which is going to look particularly weird in this scenario. So yeah, don't do that. Let's just undo that. And yeah, so there we go. So that's the force empty measures to minimum measure width. Now the next two options here, in parts, ignore clefs and grace notes. I'm not going to demonstrate this too much. I'm just going to kind of tell you what these are. The ignore clefs, the position of the clefs are not really unlinkable in Finale. So this option, if you run this plugin in a part, and if the clefs option is unchecked in this in the document options here, then it will tell the plugin to not move the clefs in the part. This is sort of a very niche scenario. It has to do with mid-measure clefs, and it's really kind of only useful if you have some cross-beaming scenarios where the clefs need to change in the middle of the cross-beam. Sometimes Finale will kind of get screwed up with spacing those clefs, so you do have to do some manual adjustments, and sometimes you just have to ignore them. Don't allow Finale to reset them. So just having that checked will help in that very, very small niche scenario. Sort of the same with grace notes. When you have that option checked, it's as if you're doing in the document options the keep current option here, and if you watch the grace note video on the music spacing category, you'll kind of know what that means. Again, this option is kind of really only useful if you had made some manual adjustments to grace notes in the score. It will prevent the parts from getting screwed up. However, I do have to say in version 27.3, if you saw my video on the update, they made a lot of changes to the music spacing and being able to unlink the grace note spacing. So the necessity for this option has almost gone down to 0 in 27.3 and later. So this is a little bit of a obsolete option in many ways. Unless you're on an earlier version of Finale, then this might come in handy. But anyway, that's what these two options do. They're really kind of for niche scenarios. And then below that, just a quick little note about this. There's an option here for Option Select Opens Dialog. So this has to do with actually choosing the note spacing plugin. With this unchecked, if you close this and you go into the Patterson plugins and choose a note spacing without doing anything, then it opens the window. But if you have this option select, doing what I just did, where you just close this and then select the note spacing plugin, it won't actually open this window. It'll run the plugin. So if you have items in the list here, it will actually run all of that the way that you have it set. It's kind of a nice shortcut that allows you to kind of set this up and not have to deal with opening this window, all the time, every time you want to use it. What's interesting that even with this unchecked, if you close this and just hold down Option and run the note spacing plugin, it doesn't open the window, it runs note spacing. So it's an interesting little option and thing to know about this plugin, that if you don't do anything, holding down Option will actually just run it. But if you have this option selected, then it's reversed, if that makes sense. So then just holding Option would open the window and not holding Option would run the plugin. So a nice little added bonus there. It helps with scripting in particular. And then there's the Close on Go option. Although it says Go, it means OK. This probably should say Close on OK, but I'm not going to split hairs here. But anyway, with this option checked, as soon as you click OK, then the window gets closed. So that's all it's doing. The save settings, I'm not going to talk about this too much. You can actually save the settings of the whole window, and what that will do is it will ultimately put in extra menu items in the plugin menu. It's kind of weird because you could end up with a lot of extra items in the menu, which is sort of inconvenient. Later on in the development of this plugin, he set up this other thing with lists, which allows you to have multiple sets of lists, which I'll show you later, which kind of negates the need for the save setting. So they kind of do similar things, but even Patterson suggests that you should probably not use the save settings and use the lists instead. So I'll sort of gloss over that for now, but I will talk about the lists briefly in a little bit. All right, so now let's talk about the meat and potatoes of this plugin, which is the middle section here and the lists themselves. So the main part of this is that you have these options for reference duration, reference width, and scaling factor. And if you remember from one of my previous videos, I believe it was 26-6, talking about the spacing widths, there's this whole these values section, and this is exactly what's in that plugin: reference duration, reference width, and scaling factor. It's basically mirroring those options, and what this is allowing you to do is to set up list items with different values for these duration, width, and scaling factor options here. And there's a couple other interesting things here. This link to time signature, which is really handy. And then there's this range, so you can choose the range of the measures that you want for that particular list item. So really quickly, how this works. Let me just go back into the score. And what's nice is that as you select measures, you'll see that the range will change. So now it says from measure 1 to 1, and then we'll select from measures 1 to 4. Or if you just select all measures, you can do it that way. But you can do it this way. And then interestingly, you can also use measure number regions, which is nice. If you just link the to the measure number region, I happen to have 2 measure number regions because I have a measure number skip from 24 to 50. So you can actually set these list items up to be specifically linked to the measure number regions, which actually has an advantage too, because if you change the definition of the regions, if region 1 changes to be from 1 to 27 instead of 1 to 24, the list item here will still apply to all of region 1. So it's actually a little bit flexible in terms of the measure range. But that's also an option. But let's have that unchecked for now. And so we're going to say, let's just do measures 1 through 4, right? And we're going to set this up. Now, the way this is set up initially is how it's set up in the note spacing, these values in the document options. So it's set to reference duration quarter, reference width 0.29167, scaling factor 1.6179. This is how it's set up. So we can just leave it like this, and we can say, all you have to do is press the plus button, and now we get a list item, and you'll see that bars 1 through 4, reference duration, width, and scale, right? That's all there is to it. So I've just set up this one particular item for those measures. Now what we can do is select a different passage. Let's say we're going to choose measures 5 through 24. And if you remember from my lesson about that these values settings. Let me just zoom in here again a little bit. You may remember that there's an interesting thing about the reference duration, and that if you have the same music in 3/4 and 3/8, if the reference duration is the quarter note, you're actually going to get slightly different spacing. You can kind of see that here. And the way to do that is to change the reference duration for the 3/8 section so that the duration is eighth notes, right? So I could say I'm going to change this to eighth notes, but then that will apply to the whole thing. What's really killer about this particular plugin is that it has this option to link to the time signature, and you'll see when you do that, it grays out the reference duration. What's really cool is that now the reference duration will be tied to the time signature. So in 5 through 8, it's still in 4/4, so the reference duration will be quarter notes. In 6/8, where I have the denominator of the time signature is dotted quarters, the reference duration will be dotted quarters. In 3/4 it'll be quarters, and in 3/8, which I have set as 3 individual eighth notes in this file, the reference duration will end up being eighth notes. So this will effectively do the same thing without actually having to create 4 different list items. So I love this option, the link to time signature option. Really, really nifty thing to do. So we just do that. We can also, if we want, let's just change the scaling factor for the heck of it. We'll make it 1.85 instead, and then set it up like this. And then once you do that, just press the plus button, and you'll see that we've just added a second list item, right? So now we've got 1 through 4, 5 through 24. The reference width is linked to the time signature, the duration rather. We got a different scaling factor. So there we go. And then we can do something here. Let's choose measure 50 through whatever that is, 61. And maybe we'll go back to, we'll make this different. We'll make it 1.45. We will go back to quarters. All right, and then we can just choose the plus sign there. All right, so then we basically have 3 different types of note spacing that we can run on this file. And the way this works, again, if you have no measure selected in the score and you press OK, it'll just apply it on the whole thing. Now, after you put in list items here, it's going to give you this little warning here. To store data within your document, a new expression category called Pat Plugin Data will be created. Please do not modify it or use it for other purposes, right? So this is important. The first time you run this, you're going to get this, and it's just telling you that there's going to be an expression category that's created. Don't touch it. So we click OK, and it'll run the music spacing, and hopefully you saw some stuff happen. Let me just redo this. So we'll just run the normal note spacing, and then you kind of watch what happens here. Again, without anything selected, it will run it on the whole file. Click OK, and boom, just like that, we have different note spacing. Let me just show you that expression category real quick. There it is, Patterson plugin. There's some information about it in this first one, just telling you not to do anything. And the second one, it's just a bunch of zeros and numbers and all that stuff. It's just code that the plugin needs to actually run properly. So yeah, just don't touch these expressions, just leave them alone. All right, so that's basically how it works. Once you have these items here, you can, if you select one and you make some changes here, you can press the update item and it will update that. We can also, if we wanted to remove something, we can press the minus button and it will remove a particular list item. Pretty self-explanatory. One other thing that I thought I wanted to show you, which I think is kind of cool. I don't know if he actually intended this to be a feature of this, but I kind of figured out a neat little hack specific to this this problem of the extra measure here, where I'm showing the hanging courtesy. I could do this with a force empty measure, but again, if you run it on the whole thing, then all the other empty measures get forced to 0, or you could just select it here. But here's an interesting thing that I figured out, is that if you actually create a new list item just for that measure, so I've got this one measure selected, what you can do, interestingly, is actually set the reference duration to the whole of the bar. So 12/8 is going to be a dotted whole note. And then for the reference width, just make it a negative number. You don't want, I'll show you what happens if you put it at 0. You would think that then the measure is going to actually turn into 0. But it actually doesn't. You can see that the measure width is set to 0.11111. That actually has to do with in the document options under notes and rest, there's this spacing before music option, which is giving you a little bit of extra space. So what I figured out is that you can actually put this as a negative number, the reference width. So if you just use -1 here and just update the item so that our reference width is -1, and then run the plugin on that measure, you can see that it will actually give you a reference width of 0. So here's bar 36, and here's the next bar where the width is actually set to 0. So this is actually a neat little trick, because if you use this note spacing plugin, so watch this, I'm just going to go ahead and select all and use the normal Finale note spacing. Again, it adds a width here of 0.875. But if you run the Patterson note spacing with that particular list item there, with that negative reference width, when you run it without selecting anything and it runs on the whole piece, then that width there gets put to 0, which is actually kind of neat. So this is a great way. Sometimes I deal with this stuff, and it's very easy to accidentally get that last measure to something other than 0 again by accident. So if you use this note spacing plugin instead, this is a good way to ensure that will always end up at 0. So once again, just a reminder that everything in the bottom of this window is applying to all of the items in the list, right? Unfortunately, you can't separate these bottom options into separate list items. I think it would actually be kind of cool if you could, so that you could choose to ignore clefs or gray notes, although there's a different way I'm going to show you about in a second. But you could set your upstem flags differently, or whatever the case may be. You can it would be nice if you can do things from here differently in the lists. But alas, all of these options will be applied to everything. So just to clear up some kind of possible confusion about what happens when you're music spacing, let's just go back and reset to Finale's basic Command 4 spacing, just so you understand what's happening. If there are no measures selected, it will run everything in this list, right? If there are measures that exist in the file that do not exist in the list, let's say there's extra measures past this point, then it will not run it will not run specific music spacing from the list on those measures. It will run normal note spacing from the document options, but it will apply all of the bottom options to everything, right? If you have measures selected, if I have just these 4 measures selected, it's only going to apply the note spacing to those 4 measures, right? So it's going to leave everything else alone. You can actually do this in partial too. So if I select half of a particular section of this list and choose the OK button here, it will apply the note spacing from the second item of this list only to those measures, right? So whatever measures you have selected, it's basically going to figure out, okay, that was in the third list item, the second list item, and run this particular music spacing on only those measures that are selected. If you happen to have measures that are outside the scope of this list, I don't in this particular case, but if I had more measures and I selected those, again, it will ignore everything in the list. It will run the regular note spacing, but it will do all of the options in the bottom of this window. Okay, so now we're going to get into something a little bit more complex here. We're going to talk about the lists. So if we press this lists button here, we're going to get a new window come up, and it's going to be called Note Spacing Options List. And there's initially one item in here called Base Note Spacing Options. And I should point out that if you look at the main window here, the top of the window actually says Base Note Spacing Options. This is basically telling you that the list that you're looking at is the Base Note Spacing Options from this list of lists. We can have multiple lists of lists here. So the way this works is actually the best way to do this. Let's go change something here. Let's actually go to a linked part. And then we're going to go to lists here, and I'm going to say copy list from main window, and I'm going to say apply to all parts, and we're going to choose the plus button here and make sure that it still says all parts, and we can change this to parts, and then just make sure that we select the update, and I think when you press OK, yeah, so now your part spacing options list is applying to all parts, right? Yes. And so basically, and now you'll notice that I'm in a linked part and the top of the window says parts spacing options. What's really kind of nifty is that if you navigate back to the score, it'll actually change the top of this window to say base note spacing options, so we can navigate through all the parts and it should still say part spacing options, right? And so what this essentially means is that you have two sets of lists. You can actually create a different list. So very simply, if I wanted to, let's leave that one, but let's delete all of the middle two here, and let's just say that this one is going to be, well, let's just select the measure so we can do this from here to here. Measures 1 through 61, and we'll choose the and we'll actually do the link to time signature, and we'll update that item. So now the part spacing options list now only has two items here. It's bars 1 through 61 and that last measure, which has the hanging courtesies there as well. So now with it set like this, we can run the note spacing, the Patterson note spacing on this part. And, well, assuming that was on the right system there, then that would get put to 0, and all of the settings from this first item will be applied to the whole part there. You can do it here as well on the vocal part. Click OK, and you get the note spacing again on the next one. So yeah, it's kind of neat. You can sort of have two sets of lists. So if you wanted to set up the note spacing for your score slightly differently than for your parts, this is actually a pretty cool way to do it. So yeah, so that's how that works. And then finally, as if this wasn't complicated enough, most of the Patterson plugins, well, some of the Patterson plugins have this functionality called expression flags, which is sort of hidden. You kind of have to know about it. If you read the instructions on his website about how these plugins work, you might find more information about that. In fact, I'll put a link, hopefully, to the instruction page for this particular plugin. Expression flags, basically how it works is that you kind of create an expression basically anywhere. It doesn't really matter. You can put it in the technique text. You create an expression and you put something very specific in the description. It actually doesn't matter what's in here. You can just make nonsense and just hide it, or just leave it blank, frankly, and it's fine. But what matters is what's in the description. And the plugins actually use this description field as sort of code for doing specific things within the plugins. So this note spacing plugin actually has 5 different expression flags that you can use. I'm hopefully putting them up on the screen right now. There's the note spacing skip measure expression flag, note spacing use score spacing flag, note spacing match score system flag, note spacing ignore grace notes flag, and note spacing ignore clefs flag. Now they have to be typed exactly the way that you see them here with the correct capitalization, spaces, and all that stuff. It has to be exactly the same, typed exactly the same way in the description field in order for these to work. If one thing is miscapitalized, it's not going to work. So it is case sensitive. Just be careful about that. I'm not going to go through a demonstration of all of these. I am going to go through 2 of them, though, because I think it's rather interesting. Starting with the note spacing skip measure. So again, going back to the description field here, make sure that you type it exactly right. Colon skip space measure. And again, it doesn't matter what's in the text field. It could be nothing. If you want to do something like skip measure, and then just make sure that it's hidden. This way you'll know that it's there when you're looking at Finale. That might not be a bad idea. And just click OK. And so I've just created this expression, and I can apply it to this measure. Now, basically what this particular expression flag is going to do is it's going to tell the note spacing plugin to not touch this measure. This is really handy if you happen to be doing some stuff with custom note spacing. So I could go in here, go in here to my measure tool and change some of these spacings around a little bit just to kind of get really wacky here. Just to kind of illustrate this, we can get all sorts of weird stuff going on with the note spacing. Again, this is a bad example, but this happens sometimes. You do need to make manual spacings in your music, right? Now with this skip measure expression flag here, if I run the note spacing, you can see that it basically ignored that measure from the note spacing plugin. This is actually a really, really valuable thing if you need to do stuff with a manual spacing of notes, because as I'm sure many of you are painfully aware, sometimes it's easy just to forget, and you just, in Finale, select all and rerun note spacing, and then all of a sudden all of your manual positions have just gotten undone, and you're pulling your hair out because you forgot that you had manual adjustments in that measure. So this is a great way. It prevents that from happening. So that's the skip measure expression flag. The other expression flag that I really wanted to point out is the match score system expression flag. So let me just quickly create one. And what's really neat is that you can create these as either staff expressions or system expressions. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a dummy tempo mark expression here. Create tempo mark. I'm going to call this match score. Again, I'm just going to make sure that it's hidden. And then I'm going to type in the exact right wording here, note spacing, match score system. Now what this will do is it will literally match the layout, or the casting off basically, of the score between the score and the parts for the particular system that this is attached to, or the particular measure. So what's really cool is that if you actually add one of these at the beginning of each system in the score, just do that real quick. When you go to each part, what's going to happen is it's going to lay out the music exactly the same. It's going to cast off the music exactly the same. Sorry, this will take a second. And it actually doesn't matter what measure these are attached to, if these are attached to the first measure, the second or third measure. As long as it's attached to any measure on the system, if that measure exists in the part, it'll match this system exactly the same. So you can see that I've got 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, etc. Right. So now when I go to one of my linked parts, you can kind of see them all sort of jumbled around. They're not the measures aren't matching the score. But now when I run the plugin, you'll see that it will recast those off so that it basically matches exactly the way that it's set up in the score. That's actually a really nifty thing. It locks the measures, it locks the systems and everything, which is really nice. So yeah, it's a really nifty little expression flag there called match score. It'll work here too. And you can see that now I just have the same setup. So really nifty stuff in this plugin. Again, there's a few other ones. The use score spacing one, which I showed you before, I'm not going to demonstrate that, but that will literally, if you have that flagged in a measure, if you make specific manual adjustments in the score and use the use score spacing expression flag, and then run the spacing in the part, it will force the spacing in the part to match the spacing in the score. So that could be useful in other instances. The ignore grace notes and ignore clefs expression flags do sort of these two options in the bottom in parts ignore clef and grace notes. It does sort of these two options except on a measure by measure basis. So if you only need to ignore the grace notes for one measure, you could use that flag on a specific measure in the part and it will ignore the grace note. So, all right, so I think I've covered everything that I wanted to cover in this video. There's a lot to it. Hopefully your wheels are spinning about this plugin because there's a lot of really nifty things that can be done. And, if you really get a handle on this note spacing plugin, you can actually sort of replace your habit of using Finale's built-in note spacing with this particular Patterson note spacing. So so some really cool stuff, a really interesting plugin with a lot of applications to it, and even some hidden functions to it if you know about the expression flags and all that stuff. So so I made it through. There you go. That is the Patterson note spacing plugin. I hope this has helped. It has helped me. I think I'm going to start to use this a little bit more in my everyday usage of Finale. I might actually set up a Keyboard Maestro keystroke to trigger this, which will actually be really cool. So yeah, so that's it for me. I hope you learned something. I hope this has been helpful. Again, my name is Jason. As always, please, please, please don't forget to subscribe, and I will see you soon in the next video.